Good morning, Nigeria. Welcome to today's newspaper review. Let's take a look at the top stories dominating the headlines today. We'll start with the Guardian newspaper. On the Guardian newspaper, the lead page is dominated by a lot of trending headlines and politics in Nigeria. We'll start with the lead page. The lead page says, Nigeria's hopeful of lower prices. Relief as federal government slashes tariffs. You get the full story on page 6 of the newspaper. Then at the top of that newspaper on page 3, INEC chairman rules citizens' loss of confidence in electoral process. On page 22, Nigeria's unrecorded spending hits 2% of GPD, says IMF official. IMF official says that Nigeria's unrecorded spending hit 2% of GDP. Then on page 3 of that same newspaper, coup attempt. DSS docks Silva's associate over ex-governor's whereabouts. The associate of Silva, the DSS has dug out his associate because they refused to mention his whereabouts. Then at the bottom of that same newspaper, this is coming from the former president, Olusegun Obasanjo, on page 4 of that newspaper. Obasanjo warns against conflict, says 1967 civil war triggers persist. He's talking about the 1967 civil war, that Nigeria may be heading towards that same direction. Then on page 12 of that same newspaper, flooding, Lagos begins removal of illegal structures, vows stricter enforcement. Lagos begins removal of illegal structures, vows stricter enforcement. You get the full story on page 12 of the newspaper. We'll move away from that newspaper to the Daily Trust. On the Daily Trust newspaper, the lead page says, Phantom Council. Presidency clears Bajamila amid concern. You get the full story on page 3 and 4 of the newspaper. The presidency has cleared Bajamila amid concerns. Then on page 5 of the newspaper, 10 killed in fresh attack on Benue community. 10 people have been killed in fresh attack in Benue State, in a community in Benue State. Then on page 19 of the newspaper, CBN revokes licenses of Merchant Microfinance Bank and 46 others. They said those banks couldn't meet up with their requirements, so they have revoked their licenses. Then at the bottom of that newspaper on page 10 and page 11, 2027, why APC replace candidates 2027, reason why APC are replacing their candidates. You get the full story on page 10 and page 11 of that newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Vanguard newspaper. On the Vanguard newspaper, why APC ditch Suswam 25 NAS candidate. You get the full story on page 5 of the newspaper. The follow-up stories, this is coming from a source report. The source says that Suswam was sacrificed to please Akume. Suswam was sacrificed to please. Okay, Suswam was sacrificed to please Akume. That's coming from a source's report. Then on page 7 of the newspaper, seize assets. Court okays Daizani's request to tender evidence of acquittal in UK. Recall the former minister that was acquitted in UK. Court has okayed the request for the individual to tender evidence of acquittal from UK. Then on page 15 of the newspaper, this is also another story that we've read before. This is coming from the former president, Olusegun Obasanjo. He says that Nigeria must not witness another civil war. At the bottom of the newspaper. This is coming from Peter Obi. He says, my presidency will unite Nigeria for human capital development. Peter Obi has assured that his presidency, him coming in as the Nigerian president, will unite Nigeria for human capital development. And then this is coming from the president, Tinubu, on page 8 of the newspaper in regards to NYSC. He said deployment to security challenge states will be guided by risk assessment. Then on page 26 of the newspaper, this is coming from the Senate in regards to the state policing. They say that mechanisms to stop governors abuse is on the way. A lot of people are saying that when this state police is being approved, that governors will misuse it or use it against their opponents, and they'll use it to do so many illegal things. And then the Senate are assuring that mechanisms, that rules and regulations will be set in order to safeguard this state police, to prevent governors from abusing the power. Then on page 15 of the newspaper, by the left side of the newspaper on page 15, this is an Oyo school abduction. Oyo teachers suspend strike. Recall that Oyo teachers headed for strike due to the abduction that took place. Now they have suspended the strike. We move away from that newspaper to the Daily Sun. On the Daily Sun newspaper, in page 6 and page 19 of that newspaper, eligible voters now to download PVCs online. So if you know that you've registered for your PVC, you are now eligible to download your cards online. INEC says full online registration available. Also, election timetable dispute. Court reserves judgment in commission's appeal. So you're free to go do your online registration. No more excuse for you. Then at the top of that newspaper, coming from Peter Obi as well, he says that his presidency will unite Nigeria for robust human capital development. You get the full story on page 26 of the newspaper. Then at the bottom of that particular newspaper, on page 27, presidency brands Adeyemi con artists and says alleged council fake. The presidency has branded Adeyemi con artist, and then he also insists alleged cancelled fake. This the follow-up story says Bajamila was first to blow whistle. So Bajamila was the first person to actually blow whistle on this reform. Then on page 25 of the newspaper, World Bank approves fresh $1.25 billion loan for Nigeria. The World Bank has finally approved another fresh $1.25 billion loan for Nigeria. Away from that newspaper to the Punch newspaper. On the Punch newspaper in page 2, post-primary role. INEC, APC may clash over official Senate list. INEC and the APC may clash over official Senate list. Then at the top of that newspaper, on page 24, fake agency scandal. Presidency faces heat as federal government prosecutes controversial director general. You get the full story on page 24 of the newspaper. Then at the bottom of that same newspaper, on page 9, dealers await clarity as green vehicle tax begins. Green vehicle tax begins as dealers await clarity in regards to that rather. At the bottom of that newspaper on page 4 and page 5, on Lagos flood, residents fault Air Force fence block drainage. Residents in Lagos, where flood has taken over, they are accusing the Air Force that their fence is the reason for the drainage and blockage. We move away from that newspaper to the Matrix newspaper. On the Matrix newspaper, the lead page, which is page 2, says alleged 400 million naira bribery saga. Presidency clears Bajamila, but doubts linger. Then at the top of that same newspaper, on 2027 presidential election, Obi unveils plans for Nigeria. Obi says that him coming in as a Nigerian president will unite the country together. You get the full story on page 2 of the newspaper. That is the plan that the presidency is unveiling. On page 3 of the newspaper as well, where you continue reading, CBN revokes operating licenses of 46 microfinance banks because they failed to meet their requirements. By the right of the newspaper on page 9, ICPC explains arrest, detention of ex-minister Uche Nnaji. The ICPC, they've explained the reason why they arrested and detained ex-minister Uche Nnaji. Then on page 9 of the newspaper as well, teachers resume work as Oyo Nigerian Union of Teachers suspend industrial action. The NUT has suspended their industrial actions and teachers have now resumed their work. And then this is on entertainment. Nollywood actor Adeyemi Ogalawon explained why he walked away from Nollywood in 2019. He has stated the reason why he walked away from Nollywood in 2019. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Monitor. On the Daily Monitor, CBN revokes licenses of 46 microfinance banks. Then at the top of the newspaper, my presidency will unite Nigeria for robust human capital development. Peter Obi says that his presidency will unite Nigeria for robust human capital development. You continue reading on page 2 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper on page 2 as well, Custom NDLEA intercept illicit drugs worth 53.39 billion naira at Apapa Port. Kudos to the custom and the NDLEA officials. Still in the same newspaper on page 2, Northeast troops neutralize 485 terrorists, rescue 595 kidnapped victims in Q2. At the bottom of the newspaper, this is coming from the CJN. Judiciary cannot afford to remain on sidelines of global transformation. The CJN says that judiciary cannot afford to remain on sidelines of global transformation. Then we'll move away from that newspaper to the New Telegraph. On the New Telegraph newspaper, which happens to be the last newspaper for the day, the lead page says that new digital education database will track every child from preschool to NYSC. You get the full story on page 3 and page 5 of the newspaper. At the top of that same newspaper, Supreme Court stops manual case filing, makes e-filing mandatory. You get the full story on page 4 of the newspaper. Supreme Court has stopped manual case filing and then they've made e-filing mandatory. That's electronic filing mandatory for anyone that wants to file a case. No more manual filing but electronic filing. Then at the bottom of that same newspaper, how DSS arrested former minister, handed him over to ICPC. That's the alleged certificate forgery on the former minister Uche Nnaji. You get the full story on page 4 and page 5 of the newspaper. We've come to the end of the newspaper review. Many thanks for watching and do have a beautiful day.